Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Overthink series interviewing experts on the senses related to our podcast series, which you can find on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. We are interviewing a bunch of experts on the various senses for our YouTube channel. And so these are really meant as kind of deep dives into a particular researcher's area of expertise, really incredible ways to hear firsthand from top international scholars. And yeah, if you want more from Overthink, check us out, as I said, on Apple, Spotify, subscribe here. I'm Ellie Anderson, professor. I teach at Pomona College. I'm like looking outside the window as though I don't know. I teach at Pomona College in Claremont. And David, over to you.
Well, I'm David Peña-Guzmán, and I teach at San Francisco State University. And we are really excited to be bringing to you this project that is collaborative, it's interdisciplinary, and it's going to give us a sense of what sensation is all about by focusing on different sensory modalities. And today, in particular, we're going to be speaking with Nicola Perullo, who is a professor at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Italy. And he worked under Jacques Derrida and specializes in the philosophical and the aesthetic bases of food and taste. So, taste is the word for the day. And he has written a number of articles and books about taste, experience, and aesthetics. In 2012, he published a book entitled Il gusto come experiencia, which was translated later into English as Taste as Experience. And more recently, he wrote another book focusing primarily on wine called Epistenology, Wine as Experience. And so today we're going to be speaking with Dr. Perullo about his work on taste, food, and wine. So welcome, Nicola. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Oh, yeah. Such an honor. We're so excited to have you.
So let's jump right into your work. And obviously, taste is a form of sensory perception. So I want to begin by talking about your understanding of what sensory perception is in general. Very early in your book on epistemology, you argue that perception is haptic rather than optic. And this is a claim that stood out for me. So I want you to talk to us a little bit about the difference between these two ways of thinking about perception, haptic versus optic, and what it means to think about perception haptically.
Okay, so thank you for the question. First of all, I just want to spend a few words about this book and the style of this book, um, it has been written as an attempt to make a kind of journey through my thoughts and ideas, maybe leaving a little bit aside the precision of definition. It's not an academic book, it's not an academic paper. So there are things that have not been clarified enough in an academic style in this book in favor, maybe, or at least this was my aim, of a different effectiveness of the discourse. It's more like a militant book with a sort of an attempt to also to a prose that sometimes it's also poetic, if I may. So this is to say that it's not a book for beginners in the philosophy of taste. I would suggest other books for entering into the subject of taste. And this book came after other books that I wrote, but also many eminent scholars wrote about taste and gustatory perception. Of course, we can mention the classic of Caroline Korschmeier, Making Sense of Taste, and the works of Lisa Elke, just to name a few, in the North American areas, of course.
Yeah, we're
So
also going to be interviewing Korsmeyer.
Yes.
yeah, that's
Part of the
great.
series.
So this is to say that in this book there is this idea of haptic and optic perception. To put it very briefly, I start from a phenomenological background, as you said, I studied with Jacques Derrida and with other eminent philosophers. I have the chance to meet them in Italy and in France during my background in the 90s. So this is my background. And also pragmatism is another of my background. So I take perception, of course, as something that is multisensorial. Taste is part of a larger perceptive scenario, and taste is connected to all the senses. This is something that normally scholars and also scientists today agree.
Mm.
But what is more compelling to me, and here also starts the division between the different philosophies, is that this multisensory perception is also an active perception, something that is ecological in the sense in which ecology of perception was proposed by James Gibson, the psychologist of perception that also was very much influential for philosophy. So, taste is part of this ecological and active uh, perception modality. And within this context, I put a difference between two different ways, two different approach that we may have toward perception. One is the optic perception, and the other one is the haptic perception. I want to clarify that when I speak about optic and haptic, they have to be understood as metaphors. I mean, optic, of course, it refers to sight, to vision. A haptic, it refers to touch. But we can perceive optically or haptically with all the senses. We can perceive, we can see things optically and haptically. We can touch things optically and haptically. So optic and haptics are not just referring to one sense rather than the other, but it is a modality toward the perception. And the difference is this: optic perception is the perception that assumes that there is a subject on one side and the object on the other side, and the subject can perceive the object, let's say, in a sort of objective way, in a way that can grasp the qualities of the objects per se. It's kind of objective knowledge. While the haptic perception is a perception that assumes that the subject is always part of the perceptive scenario, is not divided from the object, is part of an ecology. So it is a kind of immersive perception. The subject is always part of what he perceived. And if you are, so on one side, according to this kind of philosophy, perception is always haptic, whether you know it or not. But on the other side, you can be aware of this hapticality of perception, of the fact that knowledge is always, as we say today, participatory knowledge, engaged knowledge, ecological knowledge. So there is no this separation between the subject and the object. So on one side, it is something that normally occurs, even if you deny it. And this is what I think and other scholars think. But moreover, there is a difference in the awareness. You can be aware of this hapticality, or you can be unaware of this hapticality. I don't know if I clarified enough your
Oh,
question, if
yeah.
it was enough clear or not, but
Yeah, no, because I think what that suggests is that there's we have this illusory sense that we are at a distance from what we are perceiving, but really there is that imbrication, and it's just a question of whether we recognize it or not, right? And I think that moves against a lot of the prejudices of the philosophers for thousands of years that, many of whom think that we are at a distance from the objects that we're perceiving in that optic sense that you're talking about. And I think I'm curious to hear how you think about wine in this respect, because you approach the sense of taste through wine.
Mhm.
And how is it that we are haptically perceiving wine, or what makes wine particularly a particularly good subject for study relative to other food and
Yeah.
drinks?
Yeah, wine is for me is a very interesting topic. First of all, because I love wine. I am a wine amateur since many years. So I use this as an example uh, because I know the subject very well from the inside. And sometimes you know that philosophers treat subjects from the outside. So they are not too much into the subject. And I had the chance, since I was 22, 23, I was a student to practice wine and wine producers, wine experts. So I am very much
Mm.
into the field since 30 years. So this is why,
I also just wanna
Not
briefly
an
interject
amateur
there and
anymore.
say not an amateur, but also I feel like it's so Italian to have gotten really into wine when you were in college, because in the US, most students can't really afford wine. We drink beer when we're in college because it's so much more expensive here, but in Italy, you can get an amazing glass of wine for just a few euros. So I feel like that story is just very different from kind of what you might find with an average American student.
yeah, that's right. It's also a matter of priority because, I saved of my money when I had my little income when I was a student. I saved my little money to buy bottles of wine instead of doing other things. But anyway, um, but on the other end, wine has been also a very noble subject of philosophy since Plato. I mean, uh, the dialogues of Socrates are full of references to people that drink wine during the symposium. They don't talk about wine, but wine is a means, is a
Mhm.
kind of connector, is a kind of vehicle for relationships and also for making the speech broader and maybe also uh, hitting some points that without wine you cannot hit. But so there is a tradition of wine talks in philosophy
Mhm.
in the ancient times, more connected to this idea of wine as a tool, a wine as a kind of companion for discussion. And in modernity, instead, wine became a point of references for discussing about the subjectivity and objectivity of the taste judgments. If you take, for example, of the Standard of Taste by David Hume, uh, he is full of examples that are taken from wine. Wine experts, wine
Mm.
connoisseurs, taste are subjective or objective. And also, Kant, when he makes the distinction between the taste of beauty and the taste of sense, he puts wine in the negative part of the taste of sense, claiming that the taste of sense is not aesthetics because, as we know, with wine, there is no possibility for making an agreement about wine preferences and so on and so on. So wine has been really the most important food item of the tradition of philosophy, and not just in the Western philosophy, also in other traditions. So this is why I chose wine, and I made this example of taste through wine, and in particular haptic perception, because people are very familiar in the last, let's say, at least 50, 60 years with an idea of wine knowledge and wine appreciation that is very optic. So it is kind of imitation of the scientific method, in the sense that there is a subject, the perceiver, the judge, that tastes the wine, detach flavors and aromas, and if it is expert enough, he can say what is good and what is bad, and make the rankings and makes all the different classifications. So, of course, I'm not claiming to deny all that, but I try to make the point that this way to look at wine is very reductive. It leaves a lot of values aside. Uh, as I mentioned, conviviality, the fact that there is the possibility for creative perception and for making some kind of appreciation of wine that is not directly related to making uh, an analytic report of what there is in wine, and so on and so on. Because people today think that the only way to approach wine is this optic approach. So using the schemas and methodologies that are supposed to be the objective ones. And I think that this is very reductive. It is a kind of um, lowering the values of wine instead.
Yeah, and I mean, when I think about wine, those two things that you mentioned definitely come to the foreground, the sociality and the creativity of wine. Nobody wants to open a really nice bottle of wine alone at home on a Wednesday night. You typically wait for that symposium, for that feast, for that
David,
social dimension.
nobody is broad strokes. Probably some people do.
Well, not a really nice one, but in general, I think that there
You're like,
is
"I
this
don't,
pull
therefore
for
don't." Yeah,
sharing in the experience.
For
No, is
example,
that fair?
during the pandemic,
yeah.
when I was forced to be alone in my apartment, wine became my companion during the nights. So it was sort of a conversation between me and some bottles of wines, because I was alone. So it was also nice. So, of course, these are possibilities that everyone has his own way to manage. But you are right. Most of the case, it's an
Mhm.
experience of uh, communality and of relationship between people.
Yeah, and I like that you move our attention away from analysis, from this analytic approach of breaking down taste and smell into their constituent units as if it was, a mechanical object that you can identify the machines and the parts, and then the logic by which they relate to one another. And in your book on epistemology, you shift away from analysis to attention.
Mhm.
And so I have a two-sided question here. The first one is that for our listeners, if you heard me talk about Nicola's book Epistenology, that's not a mistake on my end. It is a neologism that he's introducing as opposed to epistemology. And
Mhm.
so I want you to talk to us about this term that you're introducing for thinking about wine, especially because in your book, and I have a quote here that I want to mention, you write, epistenology proposes precisely an ecology of attention, as
Mhm.
caring, listening, making with wine. And so it stood out to me that you talk about the importance of not thinking about wine analytically, but it doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to wine.
Mhm.
It's just a different model of relating and thinking through the experience of,
Mhm.
of wine tasting and wine drinking. So, talk to us about the term epistenology and its relationship to attention.
Yeah. Um, shifting, perceiving haptically wine means to shift from attention to objects to attention to process. So processes are to be attended, not the objects. So, as you said, it's not an attention toward the analytical compounds of wine. It's not about an attention toward fragmentation. It's an attention toward the flux, the wholeness, the process. So this is a way to put the difference between haptic and optic. And attention is also important because it gives the idea of something that is not prefixed and predetermined in advance. Attention is something that goes along the experience. You are attentive to something that is happening, and attention is something that is always forward oriented. Intention, instead, is composed by objectives and goals that you normally know in advance. And the idea is, with wine, I'm supposed to know how this wine should be. I judge this wine according to what I supposed to know in advance. A wine should be like this, then that, and that. Should have these flavors, should have these aromas, and so. So when I taste the wine, I will put my attention within this intentional framework. This intentional framework I know already. Instead, I try to propose an approach in which we should be more concerned with exploration. And attention is a mode of exploration without prefixed rules, goals, and criteria. Going to the other question about epistenology, this was born like a kind of joke when I started to think about the project. I started to think about the project in 2014, 15, and the idea was to make a pun between epistemology and enology. So epistemology and enology, they meld together and epistenology comes out. So epistenology could be, in one sense, the knowledge about wine, the knowledge of wine, the epistemology of wine. This is the
And
first.
the root of what's the meaning of enology?
Enology is the science of wine, because
Yeah.
enos, oinos in ancient Greek is wine.
Okay.
It's
And
like
for
the
those
word
listeners who might not
enotech.
know.
Yes, yeah.
I like Enoteca.
The word enotech is the
Yeah.
place in which you can buy wine. So
Interesting.
comes from this word oinos, that is enos, that means wine in Greek. So enology is the science of wine.
And
Technically
epistemology
speaking,
is theory of knowledge, just for folks who might not
yeah,
know that already. Hopefully you Googled it
and
because you're watching this on YouTube, but
yeah, and the enologist is the expert, the scientist that works in the cellar and is the one that makes fermentations, all the things to make the wine. So this is enology. So it is a sort of crisis, a sort of melt between epistemology and enology. There is also a more philosophical and subtle meaning that I mention in the book. I don't know if you want to know also this, but it has to do with my approach that is not cognitivist and it is not realist. I belong to a different side of philosophy. And the second meaning is a fusion between epistemology, the normal word with M, and ontology. And there is a debate in today philosophy. It's a classic debate, the difference between ontology and epistemology. Ontology is the science of being, and epistemology is the science of knowing. There are philosophers that think that there is a sharp distinction between being and knowing, between ontology and epistemology, and there are philosophers like me that think that there is not such a sharp distinction. There is a sort of friction and continuous relationship and correspondence between ontology and epistemology. So the N of ontology went to the realm of epistemology and took the M out. So epistenology is a sort of combination between the two, ontology. But this is something that is more for technical philosophers. This is a book that has different levels of reading. It can be read by people that are in the worlds of wine, and of course they are not so much interested in all this philosophical debate. And there are people that are more into these debates, so they can also see my framework behind this idea of wine.
Mhm. Great. Yeah, thank you. I have one substantive question, and after I ask it, I want to close with just like a super quick, less substantive question. The substantive question is, so thinking about the distinction, you draw a distinction in the book between inebriation and intoxication, which I think is not necessarily a self-evident distinction to everybody. In fact, David, you and I did an episode of Overthink back in December 2021 on intoxication, and we really didn't distinguish between the two. And in retrospect, should have brought in a little Perullo into that. So I'm curious, how do you see the difference between inebriation and intoxication? And what does inebriation offer that maybe intoxication doesn't?
Yeah. Here the question is very important and crucial, because I don't want to that epistemology to be understood as an apology of drunkenness, of wine as a beverage that has to be taken without limits, and so the difference between inebriation and intoxication, to put it very simply, is the following. Intoxication is the state in which the doors of perception close and you don't have any vigilance anymore. You don't have any more vigilance. You don't have any more attention to what's happening around, because you lost the senses. It's the experience of drunkenness. You are in the flow, but without any control, or at least any more any left vigilance in this. Inebriation, instead, it is the thin line that has to be cultivated. It is an art in which you taste wine. This gives you pleasure. This, of course, is also a drug, because technically speaking, alcohol is a drug. And you push this until the threshold in which you can maintain a sort of active vigilance on your thoughts, on your sentiments, on your mind. And I think this is the difference between the motto, the ancient motto, in vino veritas, there is truth in wine. And there is truth in wine. It is exactly in this sense. When you are within this threshold, you speak with more sincerity, you can have better relationship with people, you can increase your sense of communality. If you go outside this border, you become just intoxicated. So inebriation is a sort of care for keep yourself immersed in the flow with a sort of vigilance that is still alive. While intoxication is also more about the way in which people today assume wine. So there is wine for experts to taste optically, or wine for drunk people, just to drink and to get drunk. I think that we can try a third way, something that is not just to be analyzed mechanically and objectively, nor to be just a means to get out of any vigilance. So this is the difference for me, and it's something that we have to learn to manage, and we have to learn to, as I make many of these exercises of epistemology through the years with students, with people that are 20, 22, 23 years old. It's also a matter of education. It's very important to educate people to drink this wonderful beverage, wine, in a responsible way, in an aware way. Awareness is very important to me. And this project of epistemology, I think, is a project about education and awareness, most of all.
That is a perfect segue into my last, final, very brief question, which is, what's a wine you would recommend?
Uh, it depends. The answer is it depends. It
Maybe a
depends.
favorite one.
Eh?
Does it depend on the person, on the situation, on the moment, like
Yeah.
all of the above?
There is no one absolute recommendation. It depends. So
Just
tonight,
a
personally,
wine you would recommend,
eh?
not the only wine you would recommend. Just a single one is good.
I can
Keeping
tell
that
you
in
what
mind.
I'm going to drink tonight,
Perfect.
if you want. Tonight, I'm going to drink a wine from Etna, Sicily. Etna is a
Mm.
region in Sicily, and it's a volcanic area. And the wine from the volcano, I love these wines from the volcano because, haptically speaking, I can really taste the earthy soil of the volcano that is very uh, burnt, very mineral. It's a kind of very bloody sensation of blood, or sensation of iron, sensation of flesh, which is really something very, very deep. It's a very dark wine. So tonight, as autumn is coming in Italy, and the temperature is going down these days, I need this wine to warm a little bit, to leave the summer and to enter into the autumn. But this is just
Ugh.
an optic description, nothing objectively, and nothing
No actual blood in the wine.
no, of course. It's a kind of metaphor to say something that has to do with these very uh, dark and deep sensations.
Mm, beautiful.
Great. Well,
Thank you.
Nicola, it has been a pleasure having you with us as our expert on the senses for this interview on taste. We thank you for taking the time. And we recommend to our listeners Nicola Perullo's works. You can
Mhm.
check them out online. And the book that we focused on primarily is called Epistenology, but it is not the only one.
Yes, there's
Thank you very
also
much.
2016's Taste as Experience and many others as well. Thank you so much, Professor Perullo. It has really been such an honor to have you join us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye bye.